Greetings, I'm Steve Woodall, the collection specialist for the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, where I work with the Riva and David Logan collection of illustrated books. And welcome to the 5th annual Riva and David Logan Symposium on the Artist Book. This is where we would normally be, inside the ornate gun theater in this beautiful building, instead of at home looking at a computer, but such are the times, and we're going to make the most of the platform we have. Looking at the registrations, we have a national and even international audience that we could not have otherwise. I'd like to give shout outs to former keynote speakers, Marianne Cause in New York and Marjorie Perloff in Los Angeles. We have attendees today from all over the United States and even a few people staying up late in Europe. Attendees also, I believe, include the great Iliazd scholar Françoise Legris in Montreal, and we're very happy to have her on hand. It's great that we can all be together in San Francisco, if only virtually. Closed captionings for these talks is available in both French and Russian, as well as English. And it will be available also when we put the recordings from the symposium online next month on the museum's YouTube channel. This is the first in our symposium series that is dedicated to a single artist. The Logan collection is particularly strong in works by the artists we'll be talking about this weekend. David and Riva collected more than 70 books illustrated by Picasso. And they found that many of their favorites were published under the imprint of 41 Degrees, Iliazd's imprint. So they began searching for others under that imprint, and they wound up owning 16 of the 21 books Iliazd published in Paris. And I'm very happy to say that we have all 16 of those at the Achenbach Foundation. Iliazd was a remarkable and an original artist in a time and place full of remarkable and original artists. But he also continues to be one of the least known important artists of the century, despite the fact that he collaborated with the most famous stars of the art world. His work remains largely unknown and poorly understood, especially in the English-speaking world, though we hope that may be changing. It's been pointed out that Iliazd said that he didn't seek fame in his lifetime, but it is also true that his obscurity is in large part of the obscurity of the genre he was working in, the book as an art medium. French livres d'artistes are deluxe books traditionally published in Iliazd's time by art dealers as extravagant showpieces to show off prints by artists they represented. Ambroise Vollard and Daniel Henry Kahnweiler were the best known of these. And of course, they published some important and beautiful books. Iliazd also produced impeccably crafted books with the finest materials, but he was not a dealer. He was an artist who came out of the radical Russian modernist avant-garde. And his books were collaborations with artists who respected his artistic vision. He and Joan Miró worked together on a project with the text of an obscure 17th century prose stylist that Iliazd had discovered. "I do not publish editions for monetary gain," he wrote in a letter to Miró in 1961. I have always struggled for an idea, and if I published such and such an author, it is always to bring attention to an unknown, and not only to reestablish him, but also to turn the tide of ideas toward him, to revise, once again, human values. This book with Miró was 20 years in the making, and it was his last book. David soon we'll talk more about this book at length tomorrow. Logan Family Foundations over the past 5 years have generously funded our projects here to create greater public and scholarly engagement with the Logan collection. The projects include these annual symposiums, 3 exhibitions yearly in the Riva and David Logan Gallery of Illustrated Books at the Legion of Honor Museum, and media-rich websites. The websites focus on various facets of the collection. The new website we're about to release will be on Iliazd, and we'll let you all know when we're ready to put it online. Each of the sites has featured an animation by animator Radek Skrivanek of an important book in the collection. For the new website, an animation of the complete Poésie de mots inconnus, one of Iliazd's greatest books from 1949. And so I'm going to show you a few stills from the animation, and then I'll show you a very short clip. We are going to have the complete animation with the complete book available in the website we're about to release. So there's the cover. Here is what it looks like when the cover is opened. Here are the 5 folios that comprise the book. And on the right, there is something that Iliazd added to show you how the book should be bound if you choose to bind it. So let's see if I can start this and just give you a brief glimpse of what the animation looks like. There it is. This book contains work by dozens of artists and poets, including Picasso, Miró, Matisse, Giacometti, Braque, Haussmann, Schwitters, and many others. Among other things, it's an amazing compendium of avant-garde poetry, poetry intended to be performed, sound poetry. And the experience of this book is in a way an enactment of a performance designed by Iliazd. I think Radek brought that up beautifully in this animation. Our mission is to open the books in the Logan collection to public view as much as possible. And with Iliazd, with this symposium, not only to open the books, but to share the work of those who are beginning to unlock them, to give us a look at some of the deep and complex creative processes that went into their creation. It's been a great privilege for me to work at the Achenbach Foundation with these projects, none of which would have been possible without the support of both the Riva and David Logan Foundation of Chicago, and especially of the Jonathan Logan Foundation, Jonathan Logan Family Foundation in Berkeley. John, who is in our online audience today, has been the champion of our projects, and we are immensely grateful for his support and encouragement and for his great commitment to the book as a work of art. So I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. I first came upon Iliazd's name 25 years ago in a book called The Century of Artist Books by our keynote speaker, Johanna Drucker. And it is still the first book I recommend to anyone wanting to learn more about this art form. Johanna is the single person who has done the most to bring serious critical discourse to a field that is in great need of it. And Johanna is the Breslau Professor of Bibliographical Studies and Distinguished Professor of Information Studies at UCLA, and an important book artist in her own right. Her new book, Iliazd, Metabiography of a Modernist, will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press in December. And here I want to say that if you haven't seen it, there is a 30% discount, pre-publication discount that Johns Hopkins is offering for attendees at this symposium. And that can be found on our information page that you may have seen linked to your invitation. We are going to handle question and answers. I think you'll have a Q&A tab on your Zoom screen. And we are going to compile those later, and we may, if we have time, we may be able to address some of them at the end of the 3 presentations today. If not, we will address them tomorrow. And as I say, tomorrow's program, if you can't attend tomorrow, will also be available very soon, within a few weeks, on the museum's YouTube channel. So please stay tuned, and please at least imagine a rousing round of applause when I say that it gives me great pleasure to introduce Johanna Drucker.
Many thanks, Steve, for that introduction. And I'll pull up my first slide here. You know, I want to dedicate this talk to Ilia Zdanévich, without whom none of this project would have happened, and to the dedication that her family, and in particular her son Francois, has continued to bring to the understanding and dissemination of the materials that Iliazd produced in his lifetime. So I thank them, and there'll be other folks that come up along the way in my talk today to whom I'm extremely grateful. But today I'm grateful to be here and on this distinguished panel, and I'm going to plunge right in here to the discussion of Iliazd. Steve has given you a kind of, you know, mini introduction, and I think there'll be a lot of resonance across our talks and points of repetition, which will be useful for those of you less familiar with the complex work of this artist. But who is Iliazd? Here you see a page from one of his books from 1955-56, Horses at Midnight, Chevaux de Minuit. And who's Iliazd? A maker of beautiful works. These are typographically exquisite, incredibly well designed. Here's a work he did with Max Ernst, one of my favorite of his works, 1964, Maximiliana. Here's a page with Ernst's, you know, imaginary writings, as well as Iliazd's layouts and designs. He would cut the engraving metal and send it to Ernst so that the compositions were already set by Iliazd's organization of the page. And here's the colophon for this page. But to ask the question, who is Iliazd, suggests that it can be answered by saying, here is who Iliazd is. And I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'd like to do is to lift that answer out of a sort of sense that anyone's life or work is simply self-evident and available for description, and instead put my discussion into what I call 3 frames of historical parallax. That as we come to know who someone is, who their work is, and to understand it, at least in my case, the historical relationship to that material changes. Projects take time. I began this project, as you'll see in a moment, in 1985, and the moment at which I'm finishing it is considerably different in all regards. And so the concept of historical parallax is that understanding and recognition of the point of view of history, that we begin with a kind of encounter, a discovery, a kind of momentum in which rushing into the project makes it enormous and very much a matter of the foreground. And then there's a period of immersion, which for me was building the narrative, understanding the biography, asking questions about biographical process. And then there's the process of retrospect, of history, of assessment. How do we understand a project 35 years later, when the very frameworks of considering modernism and its identity and its accomplishments have also changed dramatically? So I'm going to begin with encounter and discovery and move through these 3 frameworks to talk about Iliazd, his work, but also my own process of getting to know Iliazd, but what it means to me as an example of kind of meta-historical and meta-biographical understanding. I first heard the name Iliazd at the Bibliothèque Littéraire Jacques Doucet, where I was doing work for my dissertation on futurist and Dada typography. There was a young man who was a student of Van Hyde Greet at UC Santa Cruz, who was working in the bibliothèque. And when I told him what I was working on, he said, oh, well, you must meet Ilia Zdanévich. She is the widow of Iliazd. I didn't know who Iliazd was, but I dutifully followed up, sent, you know, it's 1985, you send a letter, you wait for a reply, you make a rendezvous, you know, seek out someone, and I went to meet Hélène. Now, had I known of the work of Françoise Legris, who had already completed her exemplary exhibit in Montreal, I would have known much more about Iliazd than I did walking into this particular building on an evening in January in again, 1985. It was bitter cold. I walked through these courtyard doors and into looking for the escalier and mounted up in the dark spiral staircase using the little button lamps that are part of the Parisian domestic charm. And when I got to the top and to the correct door and knocked, this tall, elegant, gracious woman opened the door and let me in. Iliazd, with whom you see her here on the day of their wedding, was no longer alive by that time. He had died in 76, and this was 85. So Hélène let me in, and she let me into down this long, dark corridor, not so long, down a dark corridor into a small chamber where there was a gas light flickering. And as I sat there speaking with her in this initial encounter, I realized I was surrounded by original works of modern art. Sorry, this is misspelled, it's Goncharova, including this portrait of Iliazd in ink by Goncharova, another by Delaunay, and another from this print series by Giacometti. And there were other similar works of original modern art on the walls. The gaslight flickered, it was sort of dark, we began to speak, and little by little, I had this incredible sense of being within a living history of modern art. Now, mind you, this was 1985. Modernism had already begun to be relative, you know, sort of critically dismantled to some extent. Brian Wallace's anthology, for those of you who are art historians, published in 1984, Art After Modernism, the Douglas Crimp Pictures exhibition from 1977. These were landmarks in the art history world for, you know, dismantling the kind of mastery of and claims of modernism. And I had been very much steeped in the feminist world, the film theory at UC Berkeley. So to me, the notion of modernism as an automatic, you know, high value concept was already within a certain amount of critical, you know, sort of discussion. But there I sat. And as I sat there, Hélène made clear to me that she wanted someone to work on a biography. What kind of strange undertaking is it to begin to write a biography of someone you have never met and about whom you know nothing, and to make the first project of encounter a biographical one? I saw myself in the service of the project, and it was something I was doing for Hélène and with Hélène, and I would come to her apartment and work in the studio, tiny studio that Iliazd had occupied. And little by little, we worked with these chronologies that had been put together by other scholars and to which we added. And Hélène, who was the keeper of all of these, you know, personal archives, would go from any single sort of item on this chronology into the archives and pull something out. So here we are, 1923, these are the activities of the year, and we're trying to figure out what's the evidence for this. I was fascinated by the relationship between evidence and narrative. What was I doing? Was I writing a character study? Was I writing a narrative? How do you fill in between points of evidence? If you notice, the last entry on this list is an Arts Week in honor of the Theater Khmerny of Moscow under the auspices of Therese, which is going to take place in Paris. Well, so there we are. We find that there is, in fact, this invitation to that particular set of events. And here then, though the March and April dates don't match up, and here then is a list of the activities that took place. Now, everything you're seeing in TypeScript is my transcriptions. The original materials were present in the archive. Xeroxing and photocopying were almost unheard of in Paris at that point. I did a lot of hand copying and type copying of particular documents. So little by little, I began to assemble all of the evidence that I could with her from the archives. There were handwritten things like this note of Iliazd, who is talking about historical process. You know, you have a great deal of difficulty to, you know, figure out these things in Russia, the conditions of the futurists after the war and the revolution and so on and so forth. So again, there were all of these correspondences and original materials. In addition to the materials themselves, there were a number, actually, these two in particular, aside from Françoise, but these two men were present in Paris. There were scholars who were dedicated in part or whole to the study of Ilia Zdanévich. The figure on the right is Régis Guiraud, whose engagement with Iliazd has been long, thorough, and deep. And he was doing his thèse at the time. He went on to do a doctorat, extremely generous in sharing his notes on the lectures, the Paris lectures of Iliazd, speaking with us, engaging with us. On the left is Andrei Markowitz, a quite renowned translator, just received some major press notice for his new translation of Bulatov's The Master and Marguerite. Markowitz is a poet, and he understood the zaum of Iliazd as well as anyone might. And Andre would come and knock on that door in the stairway and come in down that corridor and read aloud to us these poems in zaum. It was unbelievable, magical. Hélène sent me to see many people that she thought might have information about Iliazd, might have known him, might have had firsthand encounters. She deftly guided my research, but did not interfere. This is one of the figures to whom she sent me, Michel Souffort, the great scholar of modern art in France. I went to see him with my, flowers and little pastry cone in hand, was shown into his study by his domestic, and we stared at each other for half an hour without any comprehension of why we were in each other's presence. But nonetheless, these kinds of encounters were, rich and sometimes led to more interesting events. Another figure in this group was Michel Guinaud, a sculptor and son of another sculptor. It's a whole story. And Guinaud had done a book with Iliazd, and he had carved these etching plates, engraved plates, to do this book, which has an Éluard poem in it. So we had all of these encounters and all of these possibilities. I felt immersed. I was seduced. I found this incredibly vital. Rather than just sitting in the library, in the Bibliothèque Jacques Doucet or Bibliothèque Nationale, I was able to meet the living witnesses of a historical past and engage with them, hear stories about Iliazd, and get to know, in some sense at one remove and sometimes more, something about the vital character and identity of this figure. So that was part of the process, and that was the great momentum towards the incredible excitement. Modernism may have been already past and certainly already historicized, but to be rushing into it in a living, vital way was truly engaging. So then the narrative, the biography, begins to take shape, and here again I'll touch on points I think my colleagues will cover as well. But I began to know who this person was in some sense. I never knew who he was. I still don't know who he was. What I knew was these were events of his life for which I had evidence, and in the gaps between, I could imagine certain things depending on what other evidence there was to support the longer narrative. So here we are immersed. Here's Iliazd on the left with his brother Kirill, the young cadets in school. Iliazd here on the right with Larionov on the left and Goncharova between them. Note the paint on their faces. Those black marks are not scars. That's them doing a futurist gesture. Iliazd becomes immersed, as Steve mentioned, in the avant-garde circles of Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was supposed to be in school, but I mean, come on, what are lessons in law compared to the possibility of hanging out with artists? We've all been there. We know what kinds of, things go on. So he worked with Natalia Goncharova and Larionov, helped to organize a catalogue raisonné of their work. And this is the 19-teens, 1913, 14. But Iliazd, who had been born in Tiflis, Georgia, the fate of that state would go through various radical political vicissitudes in the period from 1917 through the early 20s. But by the time that Iliazd had become familiar with this kind of work, the small artist books, these are tiny artist books. Notice that right here is a staple, so that gives you some sense of the scale, that little rusted spot. You know, the bedevilment of curators, you know, metal staples. But by the time Iliazd had become familiar with the kind of, you know, exuberant and self-produced work that was going on in the Russian avant-garde, he had also become familiar with the work of Filippo Marinetti. And Iliazd remained a fan of Marinetti's long past the time that others of his cohort had dropped away, repelled by Marinetti's politics and his alignment with and loyalty to Mussolini. But the typographic excitement in a work like this, published in 1914, was something that would, you know, influence Iliazd's own vision of the possibilities of letterpress typography. Iliazd would not make books like this; he would make books like this. So by the time he goes back to Tiflis in 1917, which he did at his parents' request, they were concerned about his well-being in the coming revolution and in the events in the aftermath of the First World War. He was ready to begin his apprenticeship at a type shop in Georgia, in Tiflis, where he began to handset type. And here you see one of the earliest of Iliazd's small books, Donkey for Hire. Here's the donkey. And here you can see it compared to a work by Goncharova and Larionov and Krychenik. You see the similarities of size and scale and some of the same approach. But Iliazd would work really almost exclusively within the realm of letterpress language. He formed a coterie of artists. They had a cabaret fantastique. There was a muse by whom Iliazd was smitten, Sofia Melnikova, and photos of her bear out good reason for any young man or woman to be smitten by her. But this is, you know, a work that Iliazd did with his brother Kirill, who did the background images. Kirill was a painter and also part of the avant-garde. And so Iliazd is actively involved in exploring new kinds of Russian poetics, new lines of compositional and investigative linguistics. He also discovered with his friend Michel Ledentu and Kirill, a primitive artist named Pirosmani, and here we see a portrait painted by Iliazd by this individual artist in the kind of primitive style that had a kind of authenticity that appealed to Iliazd and to the futurists, all of whom, remember, are trying to recover a kind of alternative history to that of the influence of French and European modernism. So events transpire. Iliazd leaves Tiflis, heads off to Paris, where he arrives. This is not the lifestyle he was living in Paris, but he managed to put the outfit together sufficiently to pose for this image. But Iliazd begins to give lectures in Paris soon after his arrival. This is 1921. And you notice that the title is New Schools of Russian Poetry, Nouvelle École de la Poésie Russe. So one thing that's very interesting here is that Iliazd, for all of his allegiance with futurism, made a distinct separation between his work, which he considered to be in alignment with that of his colleague Igor Terentiev and Krychenik, Alexei Krychenik, which was to say that he was a Zaum poet. Mayakovsky was a futurist. And as his lectures went on, he began to continually make these distinctions and to see himself as a practitioner of Zaum. Zaum is the attempt to use sound and morphology to get at the affective dimensions of language rather than to work within traditional semantics or compositional modes. Here in this magnificent poster with its subtle cut across the type and printing virtuosity, you see another advertisement for Iliazd, you know, calling himself a cretin, you know, a lazy thing, an assassin, and so forth, giving again more lectures. Another here hand-painted, handmade poster for yet another event at the same studio of Olenin Dalheim. So again, active engagement. It's 1921, 1922, 1923. Iliazd produced the last of what was a cycle of Zaum books. This was number 5. The first 4 were produced like Donkey for Hire in Tiflis. This has a collage cover by Natan Granowski, and its interior pages display the fully mature Iliazd doing work in what he called orchestral verse. You see it scored on the right, and this inventive expressive language on the left. 1923 remembers the same year as the publication of For the Voice by Mayakovsky, so beautifully typographically scored by L. Lissitzky. So these two works share certain things, but I don't think they were aware of each other. Iliazd using the contents of the typecase to make large-scale letters and do other innovations on the page. The circles in Paris in the early 20s were filled with interesting artists and figures. It was an international scene, but Dada was diminishing, and Dada and Futurism were both associated with pre-World War I sensibilities, and they were falling out of favor. Tristan Tzara, whose play The Gas Heart with costumes by Sonia Delaunay was performed at this Théâtre Michel in 1923. This event precipitated an incredible bagarre, scandal, battle among a number of people who were present, including Paul Éluard. And this event is considered the sort of final moment in Dada. Here I go back to the evidence to show you how we would work back and forth then from an event like this into the evidence within the archive. You can see my beautiful paperclip marks and edits, and this is from a long piece, on Approchant Éluard. And here you see the description of what happened at that event in Iliazd's own language. So this is my transcription from the French and from a handwritten manuscript, but there it is. And here another transcription of a letter from Éluard to Iliazd in August about a trial that was supposed to take place in relationship to that event. So again, the narrative unfolds. But Iliazd's fortunes began to take a turn. He met Simone Axel Brocard, a beautiful young model, and married her. He wanted to make a living and became involved in fabric design and worked for Coco Chanel and designed modifications of a loom. And as I'm sure Tom Kitson will tell us in more detail, he also wrote novels during this period. So this is the 20s, right? And then comes 29 and the 30s, and things are difficult. And there's a kind of downfall, of course, the global depression and following the stock market crash. And throughout the 30s, Iliazd is persisting and trying to make a living. He has 2 small children. But by the end of the 30s, he had decided to go back to the print shop. And here he is seen with the same figure that Steve showed you earlier, Louis Barnier, in a print shop in Paris that had Russian connections. Shalit and Snegarov had originally established it. So there was Cyrillic type. But that isn't really what Iliazd would make use of. He would ultimately use a particular Gil Sans for his work. The thing that distinguished Iliazd among the printers and the poets and the editors is, of course, that he set his own type and did the design, conception, and production and supervision of his editions. But in 1939, we see a moment where the narrative, up till this point, largely encased within artistic and aesthetic activities, hits a kind of historical background event. It's 1939. He produces Avant, which is this book with Picasso, and he's suddenly in the midst of the beginnings of World War II, the invasion of France, and he's walking around Paris trying to sell this book, and he says there isn't even room on the tables of the cafes to put anything down because everyone's got their gas masks. So he's starting into this new adventure of making these deluxe editions, and he encounters the war. So he has to survive. Picasso, of course, was one of the friendships that he cultivated throughout his life to create books. As Steve pointed out earlier, there were many other figures from the avant-garde and French circles in Paris with whom he was involved. There's no evidence, I don't know, Tom Kitson, you may have some interesting insights on this, but there's no evidence that he was involved with the Anglophone community, no crossovers with Sylvia Beach and that circle and so forth. Anyway, in after the war ends and he begins to be interested in doing editions again, he has an encounter with a man named Isidore Izu, a Romanian who had arrived in Paris and started making claims about his own work, Izu's work, in the name of a movement he dubbed lettrism. Iliazd became increasingly impatient with Izu's ignorance about the historical past and the precedents for the kind of work that Izu was doing. And that was the motivation to make this wonderful book that Steve showed you a kind of animated engagement with earlier. Don't cut my pages. These folded pages here, you see them in the folio Steve was showing us, are here for a reason. This is a work by Izu. The claims of the lettress were fascinating. I met Maurice Lemaitre, had a very interesting set of exchanges with him in this period. But the thing to understand here is that this book in 1948-49 is the first anthology of experimental visual and typographic and sound poetry ever put together. The subsequent anthologies will come, but this was the first time this group of innovators was put into an anthologized form. So it's a tremendously significant work. Here you see the kind of prep that Iliazd involved himself with in the hand drawing of every single letter that would end up in print. All right, so again, Iliazd's engagement with design was thorough and complete. This is a page from La Maigre, again, images by Picasso. And this book, if you see it in total, is a work of complete symmetry to the letter. It begins and ends, right, with mirroring of the entire text. Virtuosic, to be sure, engaged with a wide circle of individual artists and practitioners and technicians. Here is a work Iliazd did as an homage to Roger Lacourière, who was the who ran the print atelier, not the print shop, but the print atelier, where many of Iliazd's books were produced. Here we see the wonderful, I hope Kitty will talk more about this, this wonderful plate that was hand-drawn by Picasso as his contribution to this homage. And here we see Iliazd's, again, virtuosic hand setting in metal type of that same text. Again, just right there it is handwritten, here it is hand set. Virtuosic, to be sure, no question about it. So how do we deal with history? How do we deal with assessment? First, we have the momentum of encounter, the kind of large, like, oh my heavens, here I am living in connection to the history of modernism. Then you have the construction of a narrative, a biography, from evidence, from information, from interviews. And then time passes, right? It's 35 years later at the time that I'm working on this particular project. So, you know, we have this man who was a consummate typesetter and designer, serious conceptual, with serious conceptual engagement in the art of the book. As Steve also mentioned earlier, however, the format of the Livre d'Artiste and the deluxe edition is not something that Iliazd invented. It was already well established in the early part of the 20th century by Daniel Kainweiler and Ambroise Vollard, among others, Albert Schirra. We could, lengthen that list. But the point is, it was an established format. It was a conventional format. And even something so magnificent as this last book, Le Courtisan Grotesque, is conceived within that framework, right? It is a livre d'artiste. Again, magnificent, incredible, the typography in here, which is achieved so brilliantly that it looks like, of course, why not turn the letters on their sides? Anyone who sets type by hand knows that every letter set on its side here has to be justified with coppers and brasses in order to keep it stable. And here we see again Iliazd's prep work, his sketches, his engagement with the absolute, nth detail of how these pages will lay out. But this book is printed in 1974, all right? What else is going on? 1963, right? Wallace Ting, 1 Cent Life, pop art, minimalism, conceptualism, right? 26 gasoline stations, 1963. Iliazd is not going there, folks. Iliazd has no interest in this kind of conceptual work, this kind of pop work, this kind of silkscreen activity, right? Nor would he have had much to do, I think, with the wonderful, work by Tom Phillips here, the first, sort of issue of a human document, the Human, that Phillips began in 1970. Iliazd ended his, so I say all of this to contextualize Iliazd's aesthetic decisions. He made deluxe livre d'artiste limited edition works exquisitely made, but he also orchestrated his life according to a certain number of aesthetic gestures and moves, also in a kind of symmetry that was present not only in his books, but in his studies of Georgian and Armenian church architecture and other of his archaeological investigations. In 1971, Courtesan Grotesque 1974 is technically his last book, but I would argue that both Boustre-Fedon and Pirosmani are, in fact, the bookends that he puts into place for his artistic work. This is a work called Boustre-Fedon. Boustre-Fedon is, of course, that way of writing, forward, backward. And here you see how that plays out on the page. Elena, Elena, right? Les draps de lit, les draps de lit. But he means for it to be read forward, Elena, Annele. Les draps de lit, till Edspartsel, se prolonge, right? He's making Zaum poetry here as a way to show the echo of the forward and backward momentum of his own life by writing poems, this for Iliazd Zdanévich, to the people who mattered most to him in his personal life. And he, again, as the other bookend, one of his final projects is this work, Pirosmanashvili, a tribute to Pirosmani that he had written in the 19-teens, now republished here, and with an image by Picasso of the old artist Pirosmanashvili at his easel. But by this time, 1972, both Picasso and Iliazd are themselves old men and aware of it, and aware that they are also retrospectively understanding their lives and careers. I wrote the book on Iliazd and his biography in the late 80s, and by 1991-92, it was meant to be published. And you see the title here is Ilia Zdanévich and the Modern Art of the Book. And again, it was a workmanly and conscientious project. But at the time, again, I had no frameworks of perception. There was no historical parallax. I was presenting Iliazd and his work without critical reflection on how we might assess his work in a moment like our own. So here it is, 2020. The book is now finished. It's a meta-biography of a modernist. It tells many of the same kinds of stories I've hinted at here that have to do with the process of writing a biography, of getting to know Iliazd through that research and activity. And again, I would not in any sense diminish the virtuosity or the talent or the skill or the accomplishment of Iliazd. It's the framework that's changed, that the whole notion of the modern art of the book does not stand unquestioned and absolute as a category without some kind of relativization. And, I'm unwilling, like many of my colleagues, to throw out the entire history of Western culture in spite of pressure to do so. I believe in art, I believe in poetry, and I believe in the great, potential for this work to be part of a shared legacy ahead. But I think now when I look at Iliazd and I think about his work, it's contained within multiple frameworks of historical perspective and understanding. And that would be my sense of how to assess his work now, give it its due, and understand it on the terms on which it was conceived and practiced, but within these kinds of, perspectives that historical distance provides. Okay, I shall stop, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It was a great talk. And we are going to, on the Q&A, I didn't see any that were submitted. So I think we will probably wait until the third talk is finished, when Kitty is finished, and have a look and see if people have submitted questions for us. And that's what we'll do. So Tim Young is our next presenter. Timothy Young is a curator of modern books and manuscripts at Yale University's famous Beinecke Library. He focuses on modern literary and cultural movements, including the avant-garde, children's literature, financial history, and playing cards and games. That is a pretty broad collection of material, but he is best known in our world for his engagement with books, manuscripts, and ephemera of the avant-garde. I have to say that every time I talk to Tim on the phone, I feel the conversation could go on for hours. I'm pleased to introduce one of my favorite people in the library world, Tim Young.
Greetings, everybody. Let me bring my screen up here and share. Thank you, Steve, for the invitation, and everybody at the museum for making it possible, including Rich. And thank you, Johanna. It was a pleasure getting to know you more recently at Beinecke, and also seeing your perspective on a lot of things that we have. So my talk is going to be from the side of the desk of the librarian and curator, and sort of the person who puts people in contact with and encourages research, such as the kind that Johanna and other scholars do. And so the title is Locating Iliazd, but it will be in a couple of different pieces: acquiring, discovering, and contextualizing and teaching, which are three of the principal activities that librarians, curators, and educators do, is that we can appreciate the context, the history, and it's one of the things that librarians do, is that paying attention to the scholarship, but sometimes sort of stepping aside to make sure that, you know, we understand that our principal role is to make sure that we make the connections between the scholars, the students, the teachers, and the material while engaging ourselves. So let's start with the legacy at Yale and Beinecke of acquiring Iliazd, meaning the evidence, the pieces of his work, and the archival remnants that allow us to actually create these armatures and these histories, such as Joanna was talking about. Our collection began with Marinetti and Futurism. Yale was able to bring in the F.T. Marinetti papers in the 1970s, and that included a significant portion of the surviving library held by the family. So with that, you can see on this slide that there were 4 books in Marinetti's library from Ilia Zdanévich. And it's very interesting. Marinetti, you won't be surprised, was very eager and active to make sure that any expression of futurism around the world that was published came in so he could document the outreach and the sort of power of futurism. So we had 4 books that arrived: Janko, Traktat Astrofashki, and Leonto Faram. And then from that, we had a seedbed to start growing. Well, we, meaning my predecessor, Vincent Giroux, who was himself, and still is, a scholar of modernism, specifically in French literature and publishing and printing. Vincent worked with one of the standard bibliographies of Iliazd works, and I say that with a little bit of caution because the standard bibliography keeps changing as we consider what pieces belong into which lines of a bibliography, which I'll get to here in a moment. But so Vincent literally had a printed sheet with tick marks, and then it was, we have this one, we have this one. And when he left the library 15 years ago, he handed it to me, and there were these little circles that I needed to fill in. I think there were 9 titles that we lacked from the sort of the standard bibliography from the 1980s. And so one of my tasks in between doing things like playing cards and children's literature was to work with dealers and also other libraries to see what they had on their shelves, to figure out how we could obtain copies for Yale's collection to have as complete a bibliography as possible. So were very fortunate over the last 15 years. And then finally in 2017, we acquired one of the most elusive of the works, which is the 12 Portraits du célèbre Woodall from 1962, the Giacometti work. So that came in, and I was able to sit down and breathe easy for a second. But then I realized that sort of like baseball stats, you have to have an asterisk sometimes. So we had completed the bibliographic list of the artist's books. But we do know, of course, that Iliazd was multi-talented and multivalent, and there are a lot of other things that bear his signature, his work, his impulse, in part, that are very significant and also very useful for understanding the larger context of the world and the work that he was doing. So I went back to the bibliography, and for example, this is something that I will admit that sort of eluded me, the fact that there are 2 versions of Pichemot, his book from 1948 that he did with Picasso. And I just was reading it and thinking, okay, it's just the work, and then maybe this is like a reduced version. But no, there was actually, and still exists, a text-only version of the work in Russian from 1948 that had just, like I said, hadn't really hit my radar as a separate object. But that was complicated because in some ways these 2 books are kind of colluded or sort of meshed together, and sometimes hard to tease apart, even when you're looking at a library system. So it took a little bit of time for me to sort of figure out actually how to actually find this text only. So we added this, so we now have 2 versions of Pichemot. It's also great because it's such a beautifully bound little book. But by the same token, over the years, bringing to light items that we already owned and making sure that they fall into anybody who's doing research into their discovery of the objects that Iliazd had a hand in, such as this one charming little piece, which is Iliazd designed the typography for his friend Gilbert Cornon, which is a homage to a famous flamenco dancer, La Argentina, done in 1956. She was famous in the 20s and 30s. So this is a collection of photographs, but also a little bit of a memoir, but by Cornon. So this item arguably belongs to the bibliography of Iliazd. And then something that's kind of interesting, that's sort of liminal, is the Crève Carl de Vieux Soldat, which is a book that Iliazd had, I think, as early as the 1950s, proposed as a project that he would do, but never was able to bring into a project form. Well, colleagues of his finished the work in 1977, and so this is something that we didn't have the final version, so we were able to add a copy. Curiously enough, when I look back, we actually were able to acquire the copy from Iliazd library itself. So it's very interesting. As a librarian, I see this book, and because it's from Iliazd library, his name appears in the catalog record, so it's actually findable if you looked for any books of Iliazd. So that's sort of an interesting sort of wrinkle that we librarians are fortunate that it happens here, that sort of falls by keyword into his bibliography. So, but the next sort of circle of material that we are mindful to add to the collection are pieces of printed ephemera. And the first thing I'll mention is actually maybe not truly ephemera, because it's a very important piece, which is the single issue of the 41-degree Gazette. There's two shots of it right there, having been repaired because it was done on sort of fragile paper. But then, as Joanna showed you, these pieces that document conferences, speeches, and appearances are also very important, not just solely for the historical pinpointing of activities during the period, but so many of them actually bear Iliazd's own hand, and so they are minor but very, very crucial, important pieces of design work and typographical work. This is actually a 1918 poster for the Syndicat für Rostov, at which Ilia Zdanévich read some Zone poetry. This one I think is totally charming. 1948, the Georgians of yesteryear, a conference by Iliazd to benefit the Women's Georgian League in Paris. Interesting, a very busy year, 1948 for him. Joanna had already shown this photograph, this item, and I apologize, I only have a section of this because of some of the difficulties in getting things scanned in the last couple months with this new situation. But this is this almost mythic poster from 1922, which is just beautiful. And maybe typographers here can easily see how it was made, but for my eyes, these cuts and everything are a virtuistic control of the medium. And it's something that I can't quite explain to my students how it actually came to be. But pieces like this, sometimes if you only have a quick moment to work with students, something like this will actually sort of draw them in very, very sort of rapidly, and that gets the conversation started. Let me get out of these slides. And then, of course, any library worth its weight would add anything that you can in terms of archives. An early piece that we were able to acquire, a small piece, which is a manifesto on clothing, the Odezhda manifesto from 1912, I believe. And this, January 1912, written while he was in St. Petersburg. And this is a multi-page, 36-page manifesto, complete with corrections and writing on the verso. But then in the terms of very more significant, larger collections, it was our great luck to acquire a archive of the preparatory typesetting and printing pieces for Posé Melanchonu, due to the gracious contact of Francois Legris. And these papers, there you see them on display, not too impressive there, but in our empty reading room. And there's one of Picasso's pages, are fascinating because, for example, here I'll show you, here are the stages of imposition for the Kurt Schroeder's and Royal Haussmann page, the merits page. I love that Iliazd name appears over and over again there. I don't know, I can't decipher the numerology, but maybe Johanna can tell us about that. There is a typographic imposition, and there is a proof page together there. And maybe even more impressive is the Tristan Tzara and Joan Miró. There is the typographical page with just sort of like the hints of the objects designed by Joan Miró. There is a pass on a paper with the printing marks. And then like this as well. I mean, there's everything. It's always great when you get a piece of, unintended ephemera thrown in here. So that's the Joan Miró on a piece of extra paper, and then all three together are something that allows you to sort of see the progress in getting these pieces to the final form. And then most recently in January, we were very, very lucky. So as I was talking with Steve yesterday, and he said, aha, Weineke is the one. Yes, we're very lucky. From the Paul d'Estravaat sale in January, we were able to acquire the Maquette for Le Maigre, which is itself just a stunning piece because it has the developmental work, but also the setting pieces. And in fact, this is, so counterpart to Johanna's printed version, this is the mock-up version, the maquette. And this is just a really great piece of sketching on vellum. Let me go here. So I do want to give a shout out to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France that has the Fonds Iliazd, courtesy of the family and Hélène, which has the majority of material about most of his books. I think that they, at least for the website, there's only missing a couple of later pieces. I don't see anything about the Courtesan Grotesque that may be held privately still, but it helps us to understand what we have. So for example, they have Le Maigre, and they actually have a maquette, but they have 12 pieces. So that for me is a ready-made graduate student project or a writer's project, is that if we have the maquette that actually has the pieces all bound together, there are 12 loose pieces in France. The first question is comparing them and seeing how they match up or how they talk to each other. And then the second question, of course, is why would these have been held apart? Or is it because it tells us something about the ownership history or how close they are to the final production? So, and then we also have the other one here. So I'm going to now skip into the sort of the librarian nerd talk, which is about discovering Iliazd. And what I mean by this is that it's one thing to have somebody come to a library and say, I'm looking for your copy of the Courtesan Grotesque. And I also know you have a couple of other books by Iliazd. And that kind of question is actually very easy to answer from a librarian or curator standpoint. But when you have young students who come to you and say, I saw this exhibition and some really cool books, some kind of Russian language, I didn't know really what it was, or I heard somebody talking about livre d'artiste, is that the same thing as an artist book? That's the kind of requests we get most often, especially from young students or in literature and history and art, where they know the sort of the general shape of something, but they may not actually know the names or the citations that they're looking for. So for us, that's very important that we can take that information and put them in touch and give them the names and the keywords and the subject matter so they can do their own discovery. And the case in point is the man himself. So the Library of Congress gives it very, very simple, Iliazd, 1894, 1975. But if you go down to the bottom here, this is the official name authority set up by the Library of Congress. Here are the variants of Iliazd's name, Ilia Zdanévich. What this means is that if you encounter any of these as a cataloger, you should use this format. But that's if you are an English language library and using Library of Congress format. But a lot of European libraries and libraries around the world, because Iliazd was and remains an international figure, you could encounter these versions of his name. And the next slide will tell you, gets into another aspect of which is very difficult, which is the transliteration of Russian into English. Very simply put, if we looked for Ostrov Pashki, Easter Island, book from 1919 in WorldCat, which is the standard union catalog for finding copies of books in the US and a few international libraries that contribute their records, you'll find that at least 3 different transliterations, Pashki, Pashki, and Pashi. that seems very, very detailed and may not be important for a lot of people, but that means that if you're trying to do a bibliographic search and compare copies or confirm the number of copies that are out there for any reason whatsoever, you actually may miss out because of the transliteration. That's a very key issue for a lot of librarians. I have a longer talk here, but I'm going to make it short, but using Poésie de Mélanconie as a case of multiple identities. Right here, you'll see this is a word cloud that I created from all of the subject and genre tracings from 10 different libraries who approach the book in almost 10 different ways, depending on what kind of focus they have, what kind of research and access they have, and what kind of audience they're trying to serve. All of these are actually very, very good and powerful words, but so here are the 10 libraries, starting at Beinecke, going to Newbury, Boston, Getty, the Morgan, and even the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. And here are all the records in a stack. That's online at my SWAY presentation, which hopefully we can provide everybody here, and you can dig in yourself. But just the quick takeaway, here are just the snips from the records of several of the catalog records for the books. One place calls it poetry-collections. One other place says the subject is lettrism. Another place, library, calls it sound poetry and Dadaist poetry, and also artist book. Yale calls it sound poetry, sound symbolism. Another institution, I think this is a museum, talks about litter pictures and lettrism. The last two places are for museums predominantly concerned with visual mediums. So what is their most important way to categorize this is in talking about the actual content of the types of printing and art printing specifically that are found in it. So prints, French, line cuts, etching, aquatints, dry point. This is all great, but these really means this book has different identities in different institutions, whether it's a museum, whether it's a library that's dedicated to literature, to poetry, to book arts. And I'm not faulting any of the catalogers. I mean, the work is actually good and robust in many ways, but if I were running all the libraries, I would say that this catalog record right here would be one of the strongest ones because it captures all of this type of material. I just also love that it has lettrism. I mean, Poésie de Mélanconie is a counter-lettrism work. I mean, it's almost an activist work to try to reclaim the avant-garde and the origins of sound poetry from lettrism, but lettrism is implicated in this book, and in some ways it is the reason it exists. So anyway, so this would be a sort of better record for it. Okay, so we get the students in, we get the researchers connected with the materials, and what's the next duty of a librarian and curator is to contextualize and teach. And again, it's one thing to do. I would love to do a class, and I've done it before, where I just take the Iliazd books and let people ooh and ah and ask questions about the typography and the setting, and look at pieces of manuscript to talk about how does you go from the conceptualization and work with the actual sort of the tools and the technology to make your vision come clear. But I also like to put things in context for students. So for one thing I do is when we talk about the Imprimerie Union, which was later one of Iliazd's main collaborator in making real his typesetting, I start with them and their connections to other avant-gardes. And for example, in 1930, Gertrude Stein contracted with the Imprimerie Union to do her plain edition, which was her own self-publishing venture. And so this is the first book, Lucy Church Amiably from 1930. At the almost exact same time, on press was at the Imprimerie Union in the same building was the first copy of the Surrealism and the Service of the Revolution. This kind of connection, basically with a printer who is just doing, the job printing, but also very interested and willing to work with sort of non-standard printing jobs, such as sort of vanity printing and science behalf and revolutionary works like this is very interesting. They also were the later printer of the second group of issues of Minotaur as well. So they had very good, auspices for working with illustrated materials. It's always good to show students works on artists on parallel paths. I never overlook a chance to show Sendrars, Les Sendrars, of course. So here's Sendrars, Frénager, and Paul Lafitte, the publishers, La Fin du Monde, filming par l'Ange and Day. It's always also good to sort of refer to, very deep Dadaist. This is Paul Eluard and Max Ernst, so 1922. We're starting to sort of bring out other books that are around this crucial period in the early 1920s. And here, hopefully the magic of Sway will work. And this is not to speak negatively of the work of F.L. Schmid and the very sort of ornate books that he produced through the 1920s. But if I take a book like this Salammbô, 1923, and then I take L'Entente d'Affaires and actually put them out on the same table, this is an aha moment for students to show them that this is a livre d'artiste in its finest sense. This is a beautiful, gorgeous work of art. It follows typography, layout, and sort of proportional image and textual design. And then comes along, this smart guy from Tiflis who uses typography as design itself. It's very sort of forceful to actually have these two things on the table next to each other, and it gets the students sort of looking further at a moment that is actually more complex. Of course, as we know, Iliazd himself then becomes implicated in the history of Art Deco because he's doing his textile design, but in book design, that avant-garde and cutting-edge sense is still very important. I also bring the students up to the mid-century and the present and talk about contemporaries of Iliazd and inheritors. One person I'd love to actually show, especially because of the beauty of typesetting and the work of the spatial relationship on the page, is Pierre Lequire. This is a later book from 1967 called La Femme A. And there's Ballet Minute, thanks to Nina Parrish for her wonderful picture. I don't know if they ever met, I can make corrected about this, but because they were both, very important in the 1950s, it's important to work with them. And of course, Jean Dubuffet, this is the great Metromanie from 1949 with text by Jean Paulin. And then the other great book from 1948, the one that he printed at his kitchen table using cheese box lids, which is L'Air de la Campagne, which is sort of the celebration announcement book of the birth of the Art Brut company. If I show students this type of layout with large letters with sort of the generous space between them, it can look like an Iliazd page, but those two things together show very, very, very simple technology and much more sophisticated press technology, and there's a lot of room for conversation about how do you make this object and how do you make this other object. Dubuffet, of course, is no slouch and made some very, very sophisticated books, but it's good to put them together. And for the present, a good example of the inheritor of the importance of layout on a page is Didier Moutel. Here is French and the English versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Of course, to be honest, this is done using polymer plates and not metal type, but it is a inherited aesthetic that is put into service of a new technology. let's say. And then his great award-winning book, R27A, which I just love to bring because, you know, if you don't know this, it's a book printed on carbon paper. So it's something that the text of the book is almost sort of like untouchable. And then the last thing I'll show you is that when I teach very, very fine, very sort of involved and sort of most labor intensive bookmaking, I also love to show something for students that brings back the possibility of doing something very simple. And if you don't know Bertrand Ornier's work, it's just gorgeous. We have all of his collaborations with Ron Padgett in the future. This is done by using, from my understanding, materials available at stationery shops. So Iliazd has pride of place when we teach, but I think it's, especially if somebody has never experienced his work, it is good to show a range of other objects that we call artist books, that we call livres d'artiste, and put them in context with each other, and then students can, and researchers can continue with the sort of the path that they want to walk along. Some go right to Iliazd, some go to the other artists, but it's good to sort of have this community all out as a, in one library as a teaching experiment. So I'll end with that wonderful photograph of Iliazd and Louis Barnier at the Premier Union in the 1950s. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much. And I think we will take a short break. Okay, we are back with Kitty Marriott. And we have decided to, there are a few questions that people have asked, and they've been answered privately, I believe, Rich tells me. So we are going to hold Q&A though until after Kitty's talk. Please don't go away. And if there are a couple of outstanding questions that haven't been answered, I think, and we will get to those after Kitty's talk. Let me introduce our speaker. Kitty Marriott is the former director of Scripps College Press and an assistant professor of art at Scripps College for 30 years. Every semester, her students in the typography class created and produced a book edition by letterpress, including several exercises inspired by Iliazd's typography and his typographic strategies. Her current project that's been going for a few years now, from her personal imprint to hands press, has been to recreate Sonia Delaunay and Blaise Cendrar's iconic artist book from 1913, La prose du Transsibérien et de la Petite Jeanne de France, in an edition using original techniques of letterpress and pochoir. And that's something I've seen take shape. And I have been so impressed with Kitty's really incredible attention to the details of craft and the deep research that went into the project. There's certain kinds of research, I think, that can only be done by hand. And Kitty has proved that. So please welcome Kitty Marriott.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm delighted to be here with all of my friends, all of whom love Iliazd as I do. And I'm going to give you a very geeky talk about him setting the type. So I hope that it's actually enjoyable because I think it's pretty important to understanding his work, looking literally at how he set the metal type. So here we've seen him setting metal type before. I just wanted to mention that he had been exposed to Marinetti in 1911 through his father, who translated a futurist manifesto for him. So he was very involved in the Russian futurism while he was still in Russia. And it was also mentioned before that he apprenticed with a printer in Tiflis. So that means that he knew how to set type with Cyrillic characters, which would easily be translatable to setting in Western characters. So here he is holding a type stick, but I wanted to point out that in his right hand, he has a pair of tweezers. So that he is very, very interested in putting in those little points and half points to get his spacing just exactly so. So it becomes important when we look at his work. So there are some people out there who really don't know what letterpress is. So let me just take a few slides to tell you about metal letters. So first of all, if you're a letterpress printer, you'd buy a font of metal. So here would be a B42 Gutenberg type that we bought at the Scripps College Press so that the students could set a page of the Gutenberg Bible in Latin, of course. And they had to put the type into type cases. And then they would use the type stick, the composing stick you saw in Iliazd's hands, to set the lines of type horizontally, one letter at a time, with spacing material in between the lines. Also, there's spacing material separating the two halves of the page. You'll see with the arrow that there is a series of 6-point slugs, 6-point wide slugs, that separate the type, plus all of those little square pieces are called quads. And they would help hold things apart so that we could print from the type as a big rectangle, so that the type, when it's locked up in the bed of a press, isn't going to jiggle and move and come off of its feet and slur. So the way I had the students at Scripps set the type was to use 2-point leads in between the lines, because otherwise the letters can shift and slide into each other from line to line. It's not very stable. But unfortunately, that isn't the way it was really done. And maybe I should say, fortunately, Gutenberg actually said it with no leading in between the lines. And you'll see that in the example at the bottom. So these kinds of things are important when we discuss how Iliazd had to deal with type in a type stick. And then you would take your type and put it on the bed of a press. We have up in the upper left an example of a Gutenberg style press, with my student putting the ink on with ink balls, and a cylinder press on the right that we had at Scripps. We had 4 of those where the students could roll the ink over the press as a relief process. So now we know how these things are printed. Let's remember that when they're typeset, they're normally set horizontally. So with Marinetti's Zang Tum Tum, which we've seen before, on the right-hand side, most of those lines are set horizontally, and that's fairly direct. Now you can imagine yourself setting these lines of type. However, every once in a while, there are some letters that are bigger than each other, about 2/3 of the way down, you can see that, or they're set on angles, or they're on curves. So this was part of the effort of Marinetti to have words in freedom that take up the space of the page in a different way from the usual horizontal type. These could have been done with normal techniques of stuffing the letter forms with spacing material to hold them tight on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you could have put in wedges of type furniture that you would cut specifically on a triangle or something. There were actually pieces of metal that you could get that were curved, where you could set on curves. But it's a lot harder. It's not so straightforward. But that was what the desire was of these futurists. I wanted to show you this page in particular from the same book by Marinetti, that it's really a cut and paste. So he took material that was already printed, cut it up, and then pasted it back together again, and then a photograph was made. And then a plate was made from that photograph, made into a zinc etching, which would have been placed on the top of a piece of wood that would make the type type high, so it would print at the same time as the type. So I just wanted to mention to Tim that you were asking about that poster that I had in my slide, in my talk, but I took it out because I didn't think I'd have enough time to talk about it. But that would be how he would have, Iliazd would have cut apart. He would have printed his pieces of his poster and then cut it apart and pasted it back again, and then had a big plate made. So I think that's how it was done, but I'd love to come see your copy in the flesh, so to speak. At the same time as the futurists were making their words in freedom, so was Apollinaire making his calligrams. So he normally would sketch out his poem in visual poetry as a shaped poem in handwriting, and then the typographer would be able to make a translation of it. Therefore, you could have multiples of it for books, or if you just wanted to have one of the pages. So how would you typeset these lines that are floating from the sky? Well, here I would challenge you to think about this as being a horizontal typesetting exercise. So What happens if we try to see if that first line could be on the same horizontal line? Or how about the second line? If we drew all of these horizontal lines, could it have been set in a normal fashion rather than something kind of strange or cut and paste? So it's possible that this was set in a normal fashion. I didn't finish the whole thing because I think down at the end, there are a few letters that don't quite match, get into my little system. But that's because possibly this was a picture taken from a book. I don't have the original. But just remember the horizontal setting. Now this one is a poem done later by Pierre Albert Miró, but this one is not evident how you would typeset it, except that it would be the easiest thing to do to typeset it in lines first, horizontally, put them together, and then push them apart, possibly rearrange it so that there are 1-point leads on the outside of them, and then try to tuck it back together again. But this is kind of impossible to know how they really did it. I would like to know, because this was done all the time in the futurist posters and things that were put out, and in poetry too. But it could possibly have been printed directly from the metal and not have a plate made, but it could have been a plate also. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the early work in Russian typography, which I'm not an expert at. So I'll be talking about the period after Sonia Delaunay had hired Iliazd to work with her on fabric design, and Coco Chanel, Sonia Delaunay had recommended that Coco Chanel hire Iliazd to work for her in textile design, and he actually ran her textile factory. So we're going to start with trying to develop a vocabulary for Iliazd. So when I talk about these things, you'll know what I'm talking about. So for example, what is set solid or letter spaced and diagonal setting and so on. So there are about 12 different things that I'm going to show you from about 6 different books. So the first example would be called set solid. And this would be type where there's no spacing material put in between the letter forms. They're just naturally on the bed of the press, stuck right next to each other, called set solid, with quads and spacing material in between, slugs in between the lines, for example. This has been put together on a type composing stick and then taken off of the stick and wrapped up, waiting to go onto the bed of the press. Or this one is the actual print from the book of Poésie de Mosin-Canu, showing in position where that particular snippet that I took out would be. And remember that these are Zaum poems. They're meant to be read aloud. There's a lot of repetition and a lot of beautiful typesetting, which we'll discuss a little bit more of this later. What happens when we want to have spacing between letters? Well, that's pretty easy. You just get spacing material and tuck it in between the letters. It could be the same space every pair of letters, or it could be variable spacing depending on your aesthetic. But also remember that we had our courtesan grotesque decompte turned with letters on the side. How is that done? And how difficult is it? So here we have letter spaced setting, where you have variable spacing in between pairs of letters on the first 3 lines. And then when we get to the GGIKK word, then it might be the same amount of space in between. And then a print could be made from this because it's all nice and tight and in a rectangle. Now, putting letters on the side causes problems because you see on the first slide on the upper left, they're falling apart. So this is the beginning of trying to figure out, how do I do that? What's really great about letterpress is that it's just so analog, you know, it's just so direct. It's not digital. You can see, you can move that little letter form up and down and stuff the spacing in there. So the solution to this conundrum with the letters being wobbly and uneven would be in the lower right-hand side, you might be able to see the word compte, where the letters are centered on each other. But this particular student didn't do a very good job and just stuffed it with a whole lot of little tiny spaces. And it's just more efficient to set it like this, where you use the largest space that would work and still be able to get it, the letter forms centered on themselves. Now that's, again, an aesthetic thing. And there's no hard and fast rule about how many points you would put on one side of the eye versus the other side of the eye. So there's a lot of aesthetic determination going on here. And you would see here from Courtesin, the title page. And this book by Adrien de Montluc was actually written in 1621. It was a satirical treatise. And this is where he got the idea, apparently, of putting those letters on the side, because the original text had words in italic, and there were some with double meaning that I understand that those were the words that Iliazd decided to turn on their side. And so here's this beautiful page with all of these words. Now, de bois is the first word there, and that means the wood. And that's not double meaning exactly. And I don't know why de Montluc would have sounded that out as something different. But anyway, I'd love to see the original 1621 version. And so again, remember that each of these words, easy enough to turn them on the side, the letters, but then you have to letter space them. So it's not impossible, but look at the result. It's just totally one of those beautiful pages of pure letterpress I've ever seen. Another example now is what about chunks of type, type where the letter forms are vertical and horizontal. Well, the horizontal we know is easy because we just set from left to right. Actually, in the stick, you're still setting from left to right, but it's upside down and backwards, by the way. But here would be the typesetting of just one of those chunks. Again, the same issue is that all of the letter forms are different widths. And so it takes an eye, developing your eye, to see how that you could make those letters all be aligned so that it's visually beautiful. And so here's another example of aligning with chunks on the left and chunks on the right, just like the Gutenberg. And so the easiest solution on this one would have been to do the rectangle on the left, just setting in lines, then the rectangle on the right, and then put them together with some slugs in the middle. Well, my student didn't do that, so she had a little bit of a harder time. She actually put a 1.25 in the middle, and this was taken off of the composing stick and then put together, because you can only have a few lines on the composing stick. And so it's a little bit off. When it's actually on a galley or on the bed of the press, it was perfect. But she had to work really hard to get that double line set. And here you see the actual print from that. So on the left, the chunks of A-E-I-O-U, and then on the right-hand side, that very strong vertical. Also notice the layout of the page. You know, I really wish I had examples of the way these poems were originally written down or published or typed on a typewriter, because I would like to know what Iliazd did with that. You know, was the original poem actually, did it have on that right-hand poem done in 1944, was it set, typeset that way, typewritten, handwritten? I don't know. I would like to know. Maybe Tim, you've got that in your archives, and I can come and look for that. Here's another example of his use of everything in the typecase. And here he's using punctuation or letters turned on the side. And again, setting the punctuation isn't hard, but turning letters on the side, you have to stuff a spacing material around it. But the idea is that this chunk of metal here is like a grid system, sort of like you're working with squares. And you just have to fill in wherever you want, and the rest is just spacing material to hold it steady. And here's the print of that on the upper right-hand side. And again, these wonderful poems are meant to be read aloud, and it's not necessarily clear how you read aloud the punctuation, like on paroxysms on the lower right-hand side. So I had my students in 2007 did a book called Kotoba No Party, where they were responsible, each student, for 2 pages each of poesy, and they had to read the originals out loud, try to figure out what they could learn from that, and then develop their own Zaum poetry, and then print it in Gilson's just exactly like he would have done, learning from his example. So that was a very exciting project, which is why I know poesy so very well. And here would be the students having a layout on the bed of the press. So there would be 4 parts there for the 4 parts of the folded page. The page was folded in poesy, by the way, so that each artist and poet could have their own space, so to speak. So you'd have to take, in fact, I have a slide maybe later, you take the page out of its little packet, and then you open it twice and read it, and then you fold it twice and put it back. And then you have to do the same thing all over again for the next one. So that's very intentional. You're not just flipping over a page, you're getting a new experience. So again, this is type furniture here. The wood is called type furniture. And here would be the cover for Poésie that is made of vellum. He almost always used vellum to encase his books. They were all unsewn, unlike his early Zaum Russian books. And you were not meant to sew them. You were not meant to take them to your French binder and have them bound. This again shows you the construction, that he almost always had a piece of paper inside the vellum to kind of help stiffen it. And then the fascicles on the upper right there holding the separate poems and images by the artists. And again, Johanna showed you one thing that I'll show you again, how Iliazd was very careful to make sure he knew what he was doing when he was going to be doing the typesetting, or this could have been typeset by anybody, because now he has such a wonderful example of how it should be put in place. So the words would have been typeset. These would be the authors of the poems. The poets' names would be typeset, then he'd cut it apart and paste it up so he'd know exactly where to position them on the page. So here he has that strong vertical line again on the left and on the right for the names of the artists as well. And this is the one that Johanna showed you before. And just to show you that on the picture, just below the picture, that chunk of type was actually slid over from his original idea. So, you know, there's flexibility. Once you design something, you can make a change. Also in Poésie, it's a great learning experience for people wanting to see how you can position things on a folded piece of paper on the right-hand side, and also how the imagery might dictate how the type is going to be set. I don't think the type was set first and then the imagery was done. I think this was bouncing off of the imagery. So here the image looks like it's doubled, and so he doubled the type. He printed it twice on top of each other. On the left-hand side, instead of being relegated to 1/4 of the page, this artist was able to have all of the page. And so Iliazd had to place his type wherever it would work. And remember that he would do it in rectangles. So there'd be 3 rectangles for the vertical parts, rectangles for the horizontal parts, and then type wood furniture to hold it all together. And some more overprinting in Poésie. The left one is just direct with a new color on it, but on the right-hand side was kind of interesting because he printed the page with black ink, and then he printed the page again without re-inking the type. So that's how he got that lovely effect. Now we have diagonal typesetting, galette, and can you imagine if this could be set horizontally? Because that's the very easiest way to set it. So here we are, horizontal setting, straightforward, just placing the letters where you want them to be placed, set apart by slugs and quads and other spacing material. So that's a direct diagonal typesetting. You can do multiple words on the same typesetting so that you could end up with a page like this. Here's from 65 Maximiliana. There's the Galati and then Maximiliana and so on in the upper level there. And this one is a little bit more complicated now. So I call this shared lines with diagonal typesetting because in the middle, le premier, LE is easy to set because they're not mixing in with each other's horizontal space, but premier, you can see, has that R sticking in the way. So what are we going to do about that R? So now you have to kind of jump through hoops and change from just your pure horizontal lines to that letter in the middle. Now you got to stuff things around it so that it's going to fit, has to be completely stuffed, can't move. So that's a lot more complicated typesetting, and you'll see le premier on the right-hand side. So every time you look at Maximiliana now, you should try to find out whether or not this page was, easy to do or was it hard to do, but more importantly is why did he do this? This was really written, the text was written by Max Ernst, and he did all the imagery too, but it was based on this fellow named Temple, who was an astronomer who found what he thought was a planet or a planetoid and named it Maximilian after the king. He was German and so on. So, the text is really the boss here, as well as the imagery. And we'll talk about that on a few more slides. So observatoire, looking at this, is this just direct diagonal setting or is this shared lines? And so you can see that O and B are not on the same horizontal pair of lines, and therefore, how do you set this? This one was set with lots of slugs, and then you put your letters in there and figure out what maybe a half quad or something might go in the middle, and then stuffing in a few other little things if it's a little bit wobbly. So it takes time, but it's doable. And it had the effect that Iliazd wanted on these pages. So this is the same page I showed you before, but now we have the harder typesetting down at the bottom. But it's still eminently readable. You don't have a problem with this. And I want you to think about the layout of the page in a minute. So here's a slightly tougher typesetting because now we have the word Marseille, which is a lot tighter. You don't have like a half a slug in between them. You have 2-point pieces of lead. So it's much tighter, and the effect is to be able to have a tighter design. And again, looking at this design, when you look at that image that Max Ernst did, do you see all of those diagonal lines and the other diagonal lines? I mean, that just looks to me like he looked at that image and said, oh boy, can I do something with that? And how about this? With he's got his planets. And then over on the left-hand side and the right, you know, they're like their own little circular planets in the sky. And on this one, where it's really kind of a web. And so again, when you look at this, is this easy to typeset? Just going into the upper left-hand corner, there the S and the A and the E, perhaps on the same line, but there's that X jumping right in there, which makes it harder to typeset. So he really wanted to do that because he knew it was going to be, you know, more complicated to typeset. But whenever Max Ernst wanted the whole page, he got it. And look at this beautiful page where now the type doesn't float down from the sky. It's actually in German, and it's from Temple himself. So Iliazd can be delicate and quiet when the imagery dictates it, just like this image in the same book. And just to reinforce the idea of the rectangles of type as you would normally typeset it. So here's Poème et Bois, done in 1961. This was his friend Raoul Hausmann, who had been a Dada artist in 1918 in Berlin and had written these Zaum poems. So let's look at the left-hand side, and we can see that that's our vertical typesetting. That's straightforward, we know how to do that. And in the chunk to the right of that, that's basic horizontal typesetting. On the right-hand image, we have the vertical typesetting and horizontal typesetting at the same time. Can we divide this into boxes? Therefore, we could make a layout for the bed of the press where the imagery would have been printed first, by the way, because that was with wood, and that would have been, in this case, it's relief, so it could have been printed at Union, but most of the prints in Iliazd's books were etchings and were printed by Paul Lacourière. Anyway, so on the left-hand side, we know how to typeset that, and on the right-hand side, it fits in a box, and we can fill this into one big rectangle and get it on the bed of a press. How about 2 more pages from this same book? If we could do the same thing, try to put them in boxes, the left-hand page works just fine. But the right-hand page now, the 6-point slug will crush those pieces of letters. They won't work. And so we have to change our strategy. Can we still stay within the same geometric space and set it with, how about let's draw a line and see if we can set it more simply than some of the floating letters with shared lines. So this one is very direct to set, and it's just a beautiful, you know, the pair of pages, they weren't across from each other, by the way, but you know, the pages in this book changing from page to page, just so gorgeous. We talked about Boustrophedon before, where he would, this is the text written by Iliazd, where he took the names of people back in his youth that he was that were important in his life, like Ledantu and Adrien de Montluc, and he printed the words backwards, not like real Boustrophedon. Let me go to this Boustrophedon. So in the 6th century in Greece, the letter forms would have been on one line with the letters pointing normally, and then on the second line, the letters would be a mirror image. And so he was, you know, Iliazd was really, really interested in letter forms, and so he knew all kinds of history. But going back, if you look at the imagery in this book, isn't this really very symmetrical too, where you have your vertical symmetry and even horizontal symmetry? So this mirror image idea could have been stimulated not just from the idea of boustrophodon, but possibly from the imagery that was being developed for the book. And Johanna actually had this wonderful piece of paper in her archives, and I looked at that for a long time. It took me a long time to figure out what those numbers all meant. So on the second line down, the ETIDEM and that 49.7, I added up those numbers any number of ways for a long time, and it never got to be 49.7, but I finally figured it out. So each letter form, the E, for example, is 6 points wide. The T is 6.6 points wide. How do you measure 6.6? You don't. And the I is 3 points wide, and the letters up on top, the numbers up on top, that's 2 points in between the E and T, 2 points in between the T and the I, 2.5 points between the I and the D. When you total all of that up, you get 49.7 points, which is 4 picas, 1.7 points. So he wanted to know how wide that was. Crazy. I mean, it was wonderful. He's wonderful. And on even staying in the same book, instead of taking the 5 en vieux Japon, the very first line, he, typeset it upside down and backwards, which is fabulous and would be easy typesetting if that E is in the middle of the piece of type. If it isn't, then you'd have to space it out and do some work at it. But otherwise, it's just a beautiful way of ending this boustrophodonic book. What about spiral typesetting or things on curves? You don't necessarily have to use these pieces of metal that they would have had even in the late 19th century doing advertising design. You could actually plan this out. So you see LAC is horizontal, ROGE is vertical, and on the side, we've got vertical and horizontal mixing up there. So again, if you think of your typesetting as a grid, then you just work it out. You start with whichever part you're going to start with. We started with ROGE at the very bottom, and then putting in the next line. And notice that some of the letters are turned on the side, and it's a variable spacing between lines. So you might have no spacing between the first and second line, and then between the second and third line, there's a 2-point space in order to get this right. So the way you do it is you just try to do it, and then you make a print from it. And if that doesn't work, you move this letter up or that one over. So you just do it by iteration. So curves don't have to have this metal piece that might have been used by some other typesetters. And here's the print from it on the front of this book. Now, this book was an homage to the atelier Roger Le Courrier had, where he printed intaglio. So all of the etchings and dry points and so on were done there. So one of the pieces for this book was by Picasso, who wrote this particular poem in 1938, Aux quatre coins de la pièce. And I found this wonderful translation by Anne Waldman and Laura Wright. You try to read that, and it's kind of crazy, which works really well with, I think, Zaum poetry, which is crazy in its own way too. So you can read that in Jerry Rothenberg's book on Picasso's poems, translations of his poems. So Picasso had made this plate that Johanna had showed you earlier on the upper left-hand side, and this is an etching of that poem that Picasso did himself. However, this plate was lost, and they wanted to use it for the book. And so just like with the calligrams by Apollinaire, you would take the handwritten and translate it into type. And so this was a challenge to me because I knew how to do all of those other little things, but I thought, whoa, what did you do here? So I decided I was going to figure this out. So I took this page and I tried to figure out what point sizes we have. So my little notes on the left, 10 point and 12 points where it changed. So 2 different sizes of type here. I had to get the measure exactly right and how many points in between lines and so on. So lots of measurements. I drew horizontal lines at the top of the type so I could see when the type would fall off the horizontal. I measured every single word, like comment, trying to get the exact measurement of it so that when I typeset it, it was going to be the exact right length so that I could have a hope of matching Iliazd's type exactly. And then you start stuffing in little 2-point leads to push the letters off the horizontal, just like that Marseille example that I showed you earlier. So this was my effort about 8 years ago to be Iliazd. And, but here, look what we have. This miracle has occurred. So this type was so valuable and beautiful and remarkable that they saved it. This was saved from Imprimerie Union. And so it still exists, and I got to get a picture of it. So I am very happy that he did it the same way, except he used, in some cases, 6-point slugs instead of 3 2-point leads. Beautiful. So to end my little talk, it's, you know, the legacy of Iliazd and all of the visual typographers and futurists is evident in a dictionary story by Sam Winston. This was done with a digital layout program. It would be pretty hard to do these letters, all kinds of angles like this in letterpress. Plus we've got overprinting of letters where they jam into each other. But if you look at what Johanna Drucker has done in her beautiful book in 2012, this stochastic poetic book was, this is just one double-page spread of the book, was all done in metal type, all hand set. She can tell you stories about this. And she just had the most fun. Look what she did with that explosion on the right-hand side. You know, she'd set the type in metal, no leads, smash it together, you know, and hold it somehow on the bed of the press. So she can tell you stories about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kitty. Wow. I'm speechless.
If we can put that in type.
Well, you know, we have had a number of questions asked. Usually, or I guess always, the answer to those questions goes back only to the person who asked the question. So what I'd like to do is, yes, Johanna.
Steve, can I just make a couple of comments? First of all, thanking my colleagues, but I wanted to add a couple of information points as well for people who are listening. One thing is, it's just a curious point, but Louis Barnier, who was the second generation at Imprimerie Union, because it had been these two Russians, Sneget and Chalit and Snegrov, he belonged to the Collège de Pataphysique. So this is also interesting to know because his interests, like what you're talking about, Tim, with different kinds of, yeah, he you know, there was a connection to the, now he married one of the daughters of the printer, so he himself is French and they were Russian. But I just think that's an interesting thing. And all the time I knew him and met him, he always was so proper and so correct, and he never gave a wink or a nod about being in the collège. So I thought that was really interesting. And Kitty, he told me this story, which I'm surprised I've never told you, that the Apollinaire Il Pleut was set with dental plaster.
You know, I had heard that.
Yeah, it's from Barnier. Yeah, and so some of those letters are not perfectly aligned, as you know. So just that's an interesting point. The other thing is also that the Fond Iliazd that is at the Bibliothèque Nationale is the fond that was sold to the Bayen after Iliazd's demise, and it's only the work that had to do with production of the books, not the personal archives, which is why I could work with Alain, but the personal archives are still with the family near Marseille, just for anyone who's interested in research. So those were just a couple of information points I wanted to share.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm going to look at the questions that have been asked, and a number of them have been answered. There are a few that are still open. Here's a comment for you, Kitty, from Marilyn Zornato. She says, "This is blowing my mind."
Well, Iliazd should blow your mind.
He thanks you for your scholarship.
Oh, great.
And here's one from Michael Pierce. Given that a number of printers, I'm not sure that a number of printers were turning letters on their sides, but did anyone start manufacturing letters of to facilitate this. Maybe not a large enough market for them, you think?
That I know of.
Okay. And let's look at the questions that were answered, since I think our other viewers and listeners would like to hear about that. Also, we have with us our panelists for tomorrow, who can jump in at any time if you raise your hand and would like to answer a question.
Can I just answer something that Kitty brought up in her talk?
Sure, Thomas Goodson, yes.
She was showing the page that has Iliazd's his lullaby for his son Shalva, and you were asking how that was written by hand before he decided to set it in type. And I think it is, Tim, maybe you know better. I'm pretty sure that I saw that in the collection for Poésie de mots inconnus. And he had done it on graph paper.
Yeah.
And he wrote it specifically for that collection. It was written just a couple years before that.
Yeah, thanks.
So.
Yeah, I need to get to Yale and spend another year there in those archives. And also at MoMA, apparently the archives for the maquettes for Maximiliana are there at the MoMA collection. So I need to go see those maquettes also. And I want to see the Courtesan maquettes.
I'll add.
I have to tell you that it was Iliazd's design, not Ernst's, on those pages, and that, you know, Iliazd laid everything out and then gave Ernst the plates and the instructions for how big he wanted things and so forth. So, you know, it really wasn't Ernst's design at all. I mean, and there was a lot of correspondence and, you know, back and forth about that. So, and the text is actually Tempel. It's his text from his notebooks. So it wasn't Ernst's text. And, you know, this was Iliazd's, he had wanted to do a collaboration with Ernst for many, many years. And he had found out about Tempel and the fact that this star had been named Maximiliana for Ernst. And he thought, wow, what a great alignment of, you know, sort of things. So, but it's, I guess it really is Iliazd's design. What, Tom?
Well, as it turns out, Ernst had discovered Tempel earlier and had already done paintings based on Maximiliana, but the idea for the book is certainly Iliazd's. And,
all the design is Iliazd's.
Something that was mutually engaging for both of them in this topic. When he saw Ernst working on the cipher writing, and he said, "I want you to do that for my book, and let's call it Ernstiana." And Ernst apparently said, "Let's call it Maximiliana because I know about this person and this whole story." So that's what I understand.
Thomas, while we have you on here, there's another question from Michael Pierce that you answered, but I think other people would be interested. Iliazd lived through some politically tumultuous times, often close to the tumult. Does his art engage with contemporary events and issues of his time?
What I wrote in answer to that, he certainly did engage with what was happening. There's his novel Philosophia is set in Constantinople in 1921 during the period when it was occupied by the Allied powers, and it's set among Russian refugees who had arrived there after the Russian Civil War. There's a long poem, one of the Brigade, that he didn't publish during his lifetime, but he was very concerned about the Spanish Civil War and so it's a poem that he started working on in the 1940s during the occupation of Paris. So it's something that was actually a little bit fraught with danger for him to be writing about the Republicans during the occupation of Paris. He started writing that in the 40s and continued into the 50s, but he didn't publish it during his lifetime. It's ostensibly set in a camp in the south of France where fighters who had been defeated in Spain, when they returned to France, they were interred in these camps in the south of France. So he certainly was engaging. And then there are other things that are probably a little bit more coded. And one thing I would point out is Poésie des mots inconnus is dedicated to all of his companions who had died by that time. And many of them had died, like Chlebnikov, who starved during the Russian Civil War, Terentiev, who was executed by the Soviet government, but others who had died in various tumults of the first half of the century. So it was something that was important to him.
Thank you. One more, Liza Mardoyan asked, I think she may be one of your students, Joanna, about how Armenian architecture came into play in Iliazd's work. And Joanna, you had a good response to that, as did you, Thomas. I'd also like David Zoom to weigh in on that, because I think he had some interesting ideas about how architecture played a role in his study of architecture played a role in Iliazd's design.
Yeah, the biographical origin point for that is when Iliazd goes back to Tiflis in 1917, and his parents arranged for him to go into the Caucasus Mountains with archaeologist Akashvili and to be on this expedition. And Iliazd was essentially hired as a draftsperson to do drawings from the measures of these churches, but it became a lifelong fascination for him. And I mean, my feeling is he really internalized the symmetries of those architectural forms in ways that became really fundamental to his designs. And that subject remained with him all his life. He kept doing presentations at scholarly conferences about church architecture from that region, even when he could no longer physically access it. So it was very important to him. Tom and David, I'll defer to you for other information.
I would add that he would rather speak about architecture at the conferences than about his fabric design. That's for sure. That's how important it was.
May I say something about that? Maybe Andre, you would know about this. So I was reading that the architecture drawings were somehow done with machines that he was able to access at Coco Chanel's plant. I didn't understand how, those kinds of machines could have for doing drawings of architecture.
There might have been, a drafting table.
Oh, just a drafting table?
It wouldn't be an automatic machine, I don't think, for drawing. I don't know enough about the history of fabric design, but my guess would be they look like they are done with ruling pen and ink. But Andre, if you know otherwise, say so.
I heard a little bit different take on this, that actually he used the architecture blueprints, or how it's called, the drafts for architecture, as the inspiration to create the knitting machine for Coco Chanel.
Yeah.
So it was going from those, because the ones that exist in those books that you mentioned, they're extremely precise, all the drawings, they're extremely precise. It's not just like a draft of something or a study of, they're done like a real proper architect would do that. And I think it's also, there is a clear influence in his designs of what can be called fabric poems, right? The one that he created for Vera Sudeikina, for example, the dress with a poem on it. And the flow of the lines, everything like this is very, very similar, I would say, to the architectural design, almost preceding this flow of Frank Gehry, for example. So it was very, very innovative and very, very controversial. And I'm going to talk about this tomorrow a little bit, especially in the milieu where he found himself in Paris. So to add to what Thomas mentioned about the philosophy, or in Russian it's called the philosophy of the futurist, right? The novel that I really hope Thomas will translate is Le Parigot, you know, the one that came right before Восхищение, before Rapture, which is Ilia's take on Paris, in which he found himself, right? So on one side, there was a tremendous support that came from Goncharova and Larionov and those whom he loved and whose friendship he cherished. On the other hand, he had to put all his what I call Zaum troops into battle to fight this conservative and extremely traditionalistic milieu where he and his close poets of the same literary experiment to which he belonged found themselves. And so I think in a sense, architecture actually helped him. It helped him to move away from this and into a more abstract understanding of what it is and how to build the book. Because of course you remember that the Shalit and Snegoryov's publishing enterprise was created for printing Lenin's Spark, the newspaper of the Bolsheviks when they were abroad. And then, of course, it became the best printing house, publishing house. Tom, I do not know how to say properly in English, typografia, but printing plant, I guess.
Printing house or printing plant. I
Yeah,
guess.
in Paris, and besides publishing the emigre Bolshevik newspapers, what they print, and it puts us in direct connection with the previous symposium, is Blessandra Transsibérienne, La Prose Transsibérienne, with and so when Sergei Romov, who used at l'Union, introduced Zdanévich to Snegoryov and Shalit, I think that the fact that was the only printing plant where La Prose Transsibérienne could be printed played a major factor in his choice.
Which plant? At Union?
L'Union.
Well, I read that he did it at Imprimerie Créteil. That's where
Who,
Transsibérienne.
Sandrar?
Yeah, that's where Transsibérienne was printed.
L'Union existed under a different name before.
But
I know that one of the typesetters for this was Snegoryov for sure.
we have to talk.
Sure.
Because
With pleasure.
everybody says, and he said even in his book, La Fin du, Séquence, this is off Iliazd. This is back to the printer, but just to say that Sandrar himself said that Transsibérienne was being printed at Créteil as was Séquence at the same time. It was Sous Press.
Perhaps, but I mean, what I know for sure that Snegoryov was involved in the typesetting of La Prose Transsibérienne, and then also he was involved in typesetting Le Calligramme.
Okay.
So Apollinaire.
I know that was done at Union. Yeah. So
Well, here you are.
So,
Sure.
so thank you. So just to get back to, just for a moment, to architecture, David, I see you're muted. If you want to unmute yourself, if you have anything to say about Iliazd and architecture.
Yeah, the best resource on that I've seen is Elizabeth Beaujour's article, which I guess exists in English, but I've only seen the French version in the Carnet 5, I think, where she asserts direct connections between elements of Byzantine church architecture and the structures of Iliazd's books. So that's the most specific thing I've seen in that regard. And I wanted to say also, I didn't know that MoMA held maquettes from Maximiliana. I know them I went to Hamburg, and the Museum for Kunst und Gewerbe acquired from Ernst both a copy of Maximiliana and at least his page proofs for the pages of hieroglyphics, that portion of Maximiliana. And then New York Public Spencer Collection has print proofs for Maximiliana. Then of course BNF has stuff, and there's stuff in Marseille.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm aware of.
Yeah, at the back of Isselbacher's books, where it talks about Maximiliana, it says what's at MoMA, that there are maquettes at MoMA.
Okay.
That's all I've read. So now I have to go find them.
Yeah, you should see them.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for their comments of appreciation for you all. And we're going to do this again tomorrow with Thomas Kitson, with Andrei Ustinov, and with David Soom. We will begin again at 1 o'clock. At the end of those sessions, we'll do something like we've just done now, which is to have a kind of roundtable discussion. And so please, those who can attend tomorrow, think of any questions you would like to ask us at the end of the session tomorrow. This has been Iliazd Geek Heaven for me. And I just have to thank you all for your deep knowledge of this subject. It's just been wonderful. And we expect more of the same tomorrow. So
Thanks, you guys. See
yeah,
you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Steve.
thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks, attendees.
We will sign off for now. Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow. Exactly.
We'll see you tomorrow.